The wind howled across the white plains, sharp and endless, as Elara pushed forward through the storm. Snow whipped against her face, each gust cutting like tiny shards of glass. The world around her was nothing but white, sky and ground blending together into a single blur. Her transport had gone down hours ago, its metal body now half buried in snow somewhere behind her. She had taken only what she could carry, a small emergency pack, a locator beacon that wasn't working, and the heavy jacket wrapped tightly around her body. Every step she took felt heavier than the last. The storm had swallowed the sun long ago, and now the cold crept into her bones. She knew that if she didn't find shelter soon, she wouldn't last the night. Her boots crunched against the frozen ground as she stumbled forward, scanning the distance for anything, a cave, a ridge, even a shadow that could break the wind. The silence of the world pressed in on her, broken only by the low hum of the storm. Then, through the noise, something faint reached her ears, a sound that didn't belong to the wind. She stopped. For a moment she thought she was imagining it, a trick of exhaustion. But there it was again, a soft, muffled cry almost like a whimper. It was weak, fragile, and close. Elara turned toward the sound, squinting through the snow. Her heart began to beat faster. She adjusted her path, trudging toward a cluster of snow-covered rocks ahead. The closer she got, the clearer the sound became, small, uneven, and desperate. She knelt down, brushing away the snow with her gloved hands until the edge of a dark hole appeared beneath the white surface. It looked like an old animal den, half collapsed by the weight of the storm. She hesitated, leaning closer. Another cry came, softer this time, and something deep inside her stirred. It wasn't human, but it was scared. Cautiously, she pulled out her small hand torch and aimed it inside. The beam flickered against the frozen walls, revealing movement, two small shapes huddled together, trembling. They were no bigger than newborn pups, covered in short, patchy fur, their thin tails curled around each other. Predator cubs. Elara's breath caught in her throat. She knew what they were. The adults of their species were feared hunters, fast, intelligent, and territorial. People had lost their lives trying to study them. Even young ones could be dangerous if frightened. She pulled the light back, her mind racing. Logic told her to walk away. Their mother could be nearby, hidden somewhere in the storm, and if she returned, Elara wouldn't stand a chance. But the cries continued, small, tired, fading. She watched the entrance of the den as snow began to fall heavier again, covering the opening little by little. The cubs' tiny heads lifted weakly, their breath visible in the cold. Elara closed her eyes for a second, fighting the instinct to turn back. She wasn't trained for this. She was a researcher, not a rescuer. Still, something inside her wouldn't let her move on. Maybe it was the sound, or the way the two creatures clung to each other like children. She dropped to her knees and reached out, carefully clearing more snow away. "Hey there," she whispered softly, her voice nearly lost in the wind. "It's okay." The cubs flinched at her voice, pressing closer together. Elara didn't move any closer. She just stayed there for a while, letting them hear her voice, letting them know she wasn't a threat. The cold bit deeper into her skin, but she didn't care. After a long moment, one of the cubs lifted its head again and made a small sound. Not a growl, not a cry, but something between. A sound of trust. Elara exhaled slowly, her chest tightening. Somewhere above, thunder rolled faintly, warning that the storm was getting worse. She knew she had to act soon, but for the first time that night, she didn't feel so alone. Two frightened lives had found her in the snow, and something told her that neither of them were going to survive this night unless they did it together. Elara brushed away the snow with her trembling hands, her gloves stiff from the cold. The wind howled behind her, but she ignored it. Her torchlight flickered over the dark hole, and the two small shapes inside became clearer. They were alive, barely. She could see their tiny bodies move with weak breaths, their fur tangled with ice and frost. The cubs were smaller than she had imagined, fragile, no bigger than house cats, yet there was something wild in the curve of their ears and the faint stripes across their backs. Predator cubs. Even as newborns, they carried the look of a creature built to survive. But right now they weren't surviving. They were dying. Her first thought was to step back. These creatures grew into killers. Their species had once been the reason humans built walls around the colony towns. She knew stories, patrols disappearing, hunters never returning. If their mother was anywhere nearby, Elara wouldn't have time to run. Her heart pounded as she looked around the white horizon, expecting any second to see movement through the snow. Nothing. Only wind, silence, and the soft, fading cries of the cubs. Elara swallowed hard. She was trained to observe, not interfere. Every instinct told her to record the discovery, mark the coordinates, and move on. But when she looked back at the small creatures curled into each other, she couldn't move. One of them shifted weakly, trying to bury its nose under the other's neck to find warmth. The sight made her chest tighten. They were fighting to stay alive just as she was. She crawled closer, careful not to frighten them. Her knees sank into the snow and the cold bit through her pants. But she didn't stop. "Hey," she whispered, her breath turning white in the air. "It's okay. I won't hurt you." The cubs didn't understand her words, but her tone made them pause. Their eyes, small and golden, blinked open for a moment, not in anger but confusion. They had probably never seen a human before. Elara slowly reached into her pack and pulled out a thermal blanket. It was thin but strong, the kind used in emergencies to hold body heat. She tore a piece from it and placed it near the den's opening. The silver material shimmered faintly, catching what little light there was. The cubs watched her, their breathing shallow and uneven. She slid the blanket closer until it touched them. One flinched, but the other pressed against it, drawn to the warmth. The wind grew louder. The temperature was dropping fast. If she didn't find shelter soon, they'd all freeze. She bit her lip, torn between reason and instinct. "If I take you," she murmured, "I'm breaking every rule I know." She glanced around again, scanning the endless white. There was no sign of life. No tracks, no shapes, no shadow of a mother returning. Just emptiness. Her mind raced. If she left them here, the storm would cover the den completely. They wouldn't last an hour. She could already see the frost forming over their small faces. And still part of her hesitated, not out of fear for herself, but for them. What if taking them made things worse? What if they were too weak to survive the journey? One of the cubs made a faint noise, something between a sigh and a cry. Elara's hand froze. She looked down, and for the briefest moment, one of them lifted its head toward her, just barely. Its tiny nose twitched, its breath clouding in the cold air. It wasn't a sound of anger. It was a sound of trust. That was the moment something inside her shifted. Rules, training, fear, none of it mattered anymore. These weren't monsters. They were lives, small and helpless, caught in the same storm as she was. "All right," she whispered, her voice soft but steady. "You're coming with me?" She reached out slowly, her gloved hands trembling not from cold, but from the weight of her choice. The cubs didn't resist. They were too weak to move, too cold to fight. As she lifted them gently from the den, their warmth, faint but real, pressed against her chest. She wrapped them in the torn blanket, holding them close, her heartbeat quick and uneven. The storm roared louder, but for the first time that night, Elara didn't feel afraid. She wasn't alone anymore. The wind howled louder, tearing across the frozen plain like a living thing. The snow hit Elara's face in sharp bursts, making it hard to see or even breathe. She stumbled behind a small ridge for cover, clutching the blanket that held the two tiny cubs. They whimpered softly, weak sounds that barely rose above the wind. Their little bodies shivered uncontrollably, and their breaths came out in faint, uneven clouds. Elara pressed them closer to her chest, but it wasn't enough. The cold was sinking fast into everything, the ground, the air, her own bones. She could feel it stealing their strength bit by bit. If she didn't find shelter soon, they wouldn't survive another hour. Her mind raced as she scanned the endless white horizon, but there was nothing. No cave, no signal, no hope of rescue before dawn. The temperature was dropping fast, and she could feel her own body beginning to lose heat. She looked down at the cubs again, the frost already forming on their whiskers. Their eyes were half closed, their movements slower each time they tried to shift closer to each other. She could almost feel their struggle, the instinct to stay alive fading beneath the weight of the storm. A part of her wanted to tell herself it wasn't her problem. She was supposed to protect herself first. That's what survival meant. But then one of the cubs made a sound, a small, tired cry that seemed to echo in the hollow quiet of her heart. It reminded her of something she couldn't quite place, a sound of someone calling for comfort, for warmth, for a chance. Elara hesitated only a moment longer, then made her decision. She couldn't just watch them die. Taking a deep breath, she set her pack down and opened the front of her heavy survival jacket. The cold bit at her instantly, like knives against her skin, but she ignored it. Her heartbeat quickened as she pulled the blanket closer, guiding the cubs toward the warmth inside her coat. They hesitated at first, sniffing the air, uncertain. Their wild instincts told them to fear her scent, to stay away. But the cold was stronger than fear. One of them made a small sound and moved forward, its little paws pressing against her chest. The other followed, trembling but determined. Elara held her breath as both cubs pushed themselves under the thick layers of her jacket, their fur brushing against the inside fabric. She closed the zipper partway, careful not to hurt them, just enough to keep the heat inside. The warmth from her body began to spread slowly into the space between them. For a moment, they wriggled uneasily, unsure, but then one curled up against her ribs and the other tucked itself beneath her chin. Their trembling began to fade. The weight of them, light but real, pressed softly against her, and she could feel their tiny hearts beating fast, matching the rhythm of her own. The world around her seemed to grow quieter. The storm still roared, but it felt distant now, muted behind the barrier of her jacket. Inside, the space felt alive, a pocket of fragile warmth surrounded by endless cold. Elara sat perfectly still, afraid to move, afraid to break the moment. She could feel the rise and fall of their breathing, slow and steady, like the rhythm of a small fire struggling to stay lit. She looked down and saw a hint of movement under her coat. Two small shapes, safe for now. Her fingers were numb, her lips pale, but for the first time in hours, she felt something other than fear. She felt purpose. The storm could rage all it wanted. She would stay still as long as it took. These tiny lives, once strangers to her, had become her responsibility. She closed her eyes and whispered softly, "You're safe now." The cubs didn't understand the words, but they seemed to sense the meaning. One gave a quiet sigh and nuzzled closer, and soon both had drifted into sleep. Elara leaned back against the ridge, snow piling up around her, and held them close. Somewhere deep inside the storm, under all the noise and cold, a small warmth grew, fragile but alive. The storm had quieted, but the cold had only deepened. Elara sat in the snow, her back pressed against the frozen ridge, her legs buried halfway in white drifts. The night stretched endlessly around her. Black sky, silver ground, and the low whisper of the wind weaving through the silence. Her whole body ached, yet she didn't dare move. Beneath her heavy jacket, the cubs lay curled against her chest, tiny sparks of life surrounded by the vast emptiness. Their warmth spread slowly into her skin, faint but steady, like the flicker of a candle fighting the dark. Every time one of them stirred, Elara froze, afraid that the smallest shift might frighten them or wake something else in the distance. Her fingers were long past feeling. She tried to flex them once and couldn't. It didn't matter. Her arms stayed wrapped tightly around her coat, sealing the heat in, protecting the fragile lives resting against her heart. The first few minutes had been unbearable. The fear that they would wriggle free, that some instinct would make them bite, that she would lose the warmth she had fought to give them. But none of that happened. After a while, their trembling slowed. Their breathing changed, fast and shallow at first, then slow, deep, and calm. It was a sound she hadn't expected to find comforting, but now it anchored her. Snowflakes clung to her hair and lashes, melting against her skin only to freeze again. The faint light from the twin moons made everything glow softly, turning the world into shades of silver and blue. Somewhere out in that darkness, the predators that roamed these lands would be hunting, their cries echoing across the plain. But here under her coat there was peace. She could hear their tiny heartbeats through the fabric. two fragile rhythms against the steady beat of her own. For a while, that was all that existed, her breath, their warmth, and the storm's quiet sigh. Her thoughts drifted as she stared at the horizon. She thought about home, about the people who would never believe this story. A human sitting still in a blizzard, holding two young predators to her chest like children. It almost sounded absurd even to her, yet here she was, unable to let go. Maybe it was because she saw something in them that reminded her of herself, lost, alone, just trying to survive another night. She felt a strange comfort in knowing that for now, they needed her. And maybe she needed them too. The hours slipped by slowly. Her body screamed for movement, but her mind wouldn't allow it. Every instinct said to stay still, to keep the tiny flame of warmth alive. Once the smaller cub twitched, letting out a soft sound, half sigh, half dream. The noise brought an unsteady smile to Elara's lips. "You're all right," she whispered, though her voice was barely more than a breath. The sound of her own words felt strange in the vast silence, but they gave her strength. She looked up once more at the dark sky. Snow kept falling, but gently now, floating down like feathers. It covered her hair, her shoulders, even the folds of her jacket, until she looked like a statue carved from ice. Inside, though, she could feel the steady pulse of life, two little heartbeats that refused to stop. That small reminder kept her awake, kept her anchored. Time blurred after that. She couldn't tell how long she sat there, maybe hours, maybe the whole night. Her body was stiff, her lips numb, but she held on. Every time her eyes drifted shut, the warmth under her coat reminded her why she couldn't give in to sleep. Finally, when she risked loosening her coat slightly, she saw them. Both cubs nestled together, their chests rising and falling in perfect rhythm. They were safe for now. She let her head rest back against the snow and closed her eyes for just a moment, a tired smile on her face. The cold still surrounded her, endless and merciless. But within her jacket, against her heart, life continued to beat softly, a sound stronger than the storm. The first light of dawn crept slowly over the frozen wasteland, turning the world into soft shades of silver and pale gold. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a deep, heavy silence. Snow lay thick across the ground, smooth and untouched except for one small mound beneath the ice ridge. Beneath it, almost buried by the night's storm, Elara sat motionless. Her body was stiff, her eyelashes dusted white, her breathing shallow but steady. Inside her jacket, pressed close against her heart, the two cubs slept soundly, their tiny bodies warm against her chilled skin. They had made it through the night. All three of them had. High above, a faint hum broke the stillness, a rescue drone sweeping across the frozen plain. It had been searching for hours, following the emergency beacon that had stopped transmitting during the storm. Its sensors picked up a faint heat signature, weak, but human. Within minutes, a search team landed nearby, their boots sinking deep into the snow as they hurried toward the ridge. "We've got movement!" one of them shouted through the cold air. The team rushed forward, expecting the worst, a body frozen and lifeless. But as they reached the mound and brushed away the snow, they froze. There she was. The missing researcher, sitting upright, her coat covered in frost, her face pale but alive. Her eyes fluttered open as the sound of footsteps drew near. One of the rescuers knelt beside her, calling her name softly. "Elara, can you hear me?" She blinked slowly, disoriented, her voice weak when she answered. Don't move too fast." Her words confused them. The medic beside her frowned and reached for her arm. "We need to get you out. You're half frozen." But Elara shook her head, her voice stronger now, though it trembled. "Careful," she whispered. "Please, don't wake them." The team exchanged puzzled looks. "Wake who?" one asked quietly. She slowly unzipped her jacket a few inches, and the rescuers leaned closer. What they saw made them go completely still. Two small predator cubs, curled tightly against her chest, their fur damp with warmth. breathing softly in their sleep. The medics stared, wide-eyed, unsure if they were seeing right. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence was broken only by the soft, steady sound of the cubs breathing. One of the rescuers finally whispered, "They're alive." Another, shaking his head in disbelief, added, "And they're calm." It was unheard of. These creatures were known for their wild nature, for their fierce instincts even at birth. But here they were, asleep, peaceful, wrapped safely in the arms of a human. The medic tried again to lift her gently. "Elara, we have to move you. You're freezing." She nodded weakly, tightening her arms slightly around the cubs as they adjusted in their sleep. "I know," she said softly. "Just be gentle." The rescuers moved carefully, brushing away the snow that had formed around her. When they finally stood her up, her legs almost gave out, but she held onto her coat, keeping it closed around the sleeping cubs. As they made their way toward the shuttle, the team kept glancing at her, unable to process what they were seeing. A few exchanged quiet whispers through their comms, still too astonished to believe it. No one had ever seen a predator trust a human before. Not like this. It was as if the creatures somehow knew she had saved them. When they reached the transport, the medic wrapped a thermal blanket around her shoulders, adjusting it so that the cubs stayed hidden and warm. Elara looked down at them, her tired eyes soft. "It's okay," she murmured. "You're safe now." Her voice was so calm, so gentle, that even the hardened search team fell silent, watching her in quiet awe. As the shuttle lifted off, the morning light spread across the horizon, painting the ice fields in gold. Inside the cabin, Elara sat with her head resting back, eyes half closed, the cubs still asleep against her chest. Around her, the rescuers whispered among themselves about what they had seen, about how something impossible had happened out there in the snow. They would write reports and tell stories for years to come, but none of them could explain it fully. All they knew was that a human had given warmth to the coldest of creatures, and in return had found something deeper than survival. She had found trust, and perhaps something close to love. The air inside the medical tent was warmer than anything Elara had felt in days. The soft hum of the heaters filled the silence as the rescue team worked quietly around her. Someone handed her a cup of warm liquid, and steam curled up into the cold air. Her hands shook as she held it, not from fear anymore, but from exhaustion. The cubs were still tucked safely in her coat, both asleep, their tiny bodies rising and falling in rhythm with her own breathing. She didn't want to move too much, afraid that any sudden motion might wake them or make them panic. The medics spoke in low voices, checking her vitals, wrapping blankets around her shoulders. She could hear them whispering things like she should have been frozen solid and how did she survive the night? But Elara barely listened. Her attention stayed on the faint warmth pressed against her chest, proof that they were still alive. After some time, one of the medics leaned closer, his tone gentle but firm. "We need to check the animals," he said carefully. "They'll need care too." Elara hesitated. She knew he was right. The cubs were weak, and their small bodies couldn't handle the cold much longer without help. Still, a part of her resisted the idea of letting anyone touch them. They had survived the storm because of trust, a fragile bond she wasn't ready to break. Slowly, she unzipped her coat, just enough to let them breathe more freely. The sudden change in temperature made one of the cubs twitch. Then, with a small sound, high and soft, it opened its eyes. The medic froze mid-step. The other cub stirred soon after, both letting out quiet, shaky cries. The sound filled the tent, echoing in the still air. Every person inside turned to look. For a moment, no one breathed. The hunters standing near the entrance, tough men who had spent years studying and defending against these creatures, took an instinctive step back. Their hands hovered near their weapons, unsure what to expect. Even the medics, used to strange situations, stood completely still. Everyone had heard stories about predator cubs, how they could turn wild in an instant, how dangerous they could become if startled. But the cubs didn't snarl. They didn't bare their small teeth or try to escape. Instead, they turned toward the sound they recognized, the steady heartbeat that had kept them alive through the night. They pressed themselves closer to Elara, crawling higher into her coat until their heads rested just below her chin. The smallest one gave a soft cry, not of fear, but of comfort. The larger cub followed, curling its tail around her arm. The entire tent fell silent. The tension that had filled the air moments before slowly shifted into something else, awe. Elara looked down at them, her eyes soft and tired, and placed her hand gently on their backs. "It's all right," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. The cubs responded with faint sounds, eyes closing again, trusting her completely. One of the hunters finally spoke, his voice low and filled with disbelief. "That's not possible," he muttered. Another shook his head slowly. "They're not afraid of her. They should be—" He didn't finish the sentence. The medic, closest to Elara, just stared, his hand frozen in midair, the scanner in his grip forgotten. Elara looked up at them, her expression calm but firm. "They're not dangerous," she said quietly. "They're just cold and tired." Her tone carried no fear, only certainty. The rescuers exchanged uncertain glances. No one dared argue. There was something about the way the cubs clung to her, as if she were not human, not different, but simply another living being who had shared her warmth. Outside, the storm clouds had begun to break apart, sunlight filtering weakly through the cracks in the tent. The light touched the fur of the cubs, making it glisten faintly. The hunters who had come to see the miracle could only stand and watch. These were creatures they had always feared, creatures they believed could never be tamed. And yet, in that small moment, all of that belief began to crumble. Elara sat quietly, her hand resting protectively over the cubs as they drifted back to sleep. Around her, no one spoke. Even the wind outside seemed to have stilled. Every person in that tent knew they were witnessing something rare, something that words could not explain. A quiet respect filled the space, not just for her, but for the strange, gentle connection that had formed between species that had once seen each other as enemies. It wasn't a story of science or survival anymore. It was something simpler, deeper, the kind of bond only kindness could create. The story traveled faster than anyone expected. By the next morning, whispers turned into reports, and by noon, the whole colony had heard about the woman who survived the storm by saving predator cubs in her arms. At first, people didn't believe it. The idea sounded impossible. A human sitting in the snow all night, protecting the most feared species on the planet. Some thought it was an exaggeration. Others said it had to be a mistake. But when the rescue team returned with video logs and witness reports, the disbelief turned into silence, then into wonder. Screens across research stations replayed the same short footage. Elara sitting still beneath an ice ridge, her coat wrapped tight around two sleeping cubs. The stillness in her eyes, the quiet calm on her face, and the gentle way she held them. It all looked too real to deny. Within hours, scientists and colony officials gathered to discuss what they were calling the first recorded act of cross-species emotional trust. For years, humans and predators had existed in uneasy balance, separated by fences, fear, and old stories. There had been studies on behavior, territory, survival habits, but never anything like this. This was not science born from labs or machines. It was simple human compassion, a warmth that no data could measure. "She didn't just save herself," one of the biologists said quietly during the meeting. "She saved the idea that maybe, one day, we don't have to fear them." When Elara woke in the medical ward, she was greeted with flashes from cameras and gentle smiles from people she had never met before. The governor of the colony came in person, thanking her for what she'd done, offering medals, recognition, and a transfer to higher research posts. She listened politely but said very little. When they finally asked her what made her do it, she looked down for a long time before answering. Her voice was calm, soft, the same tone she had used to whisper to the cubs that night. "They didn't need a scientist," she said simply. "They needed someone warm." Those words spread faster than the story itself. Someone recorded them, and soon they appeared on every screen, quoted in every report. They needed someone warm. People started repeating it to each other, not just about the cubs, but about themselves. A reminder of what it meant to be human in a world where everything was cold, mechanical, and distant. It became a kind of quiet anthem, a sentence that carried more hope than any speech or discovery. Over the next few days, the colony's atmosphere changed. The hunters who once saw predators only as threats began to look at them differently. Scientists who had spent their lives studying from afar started to wonder what might happen if they approached with understanding instead of fear. Children in the colony schools drew pictures of Elara and the cubs, coloring them with bright oranges and whites, writing beneath them, "Warmth is stronger than fear." Elara, meanwhile, stayed mostly silent about it all. She didn't like the attention or the praise. She continued her quiet work, spending her time studying the frozen terrain and helping in the shelters. When people came to see her, she always smiled politely but gently changed the subject. The cubs were transferred to an observation center under her supervision, and every morning she visited them. The moment she entered, they would rush to the glass barrier, pressing their small heads against it, still recognizing her scent, her voice. The scientists called it conditioning, but she knew better. It was trust, something beyond logic or training. One evening, as the sun set over the ice fields, she stood by the window watching the light fade. Her reflection blended with the frozen horizon. The colony behind her buzzed with noise and progress, but for Elara, the moment was simple. She thought back to that night, the silence, the storm, and the two small hearts beating beneath her coat. In a world of machines and survival, something small and quiet had reminded everyone what humanity truly meant. She smiled faintly, her breath fogging the glass. The world didn't need more heroes, she thought. It just needed more warmth. Many years passed, and the frozen world that had once been divided by fear slowly began to change. The colony grew into a thriving settlement, with lights stretching across the snowfields where only wind had once lived. Humans and predators, who had once kept their distance, now worked side by side in quiet harmony. The bond that began on that stormy night with one woman and two small cubs had become something far greater, a bridge between species that no one could have imagined. The predators no longer roamed as enemies. They walked the edges of human camps without aggression, watching, learning, and in time they began to trust. The first recorded act of that trust was written in every colony textbook. The night a human gave warmth to two young predators and asked for nothing in return. Children in the colony schools learned the story before they even learned to read. They drew pictures of the woman in the snow, her coat wrapped tight, and two small cubs asleep against her chest. Teachers told it not as a tale of science, but as a story of heart, of what it meant to be human. "She didn't fight the storm," the teachers would say. "She stayed still so the cubs could sleep." Those words became a lesson repeated in every generation, a quiet reminder that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it simply endures. In the great archives of the colony, where every discovery and every life was recorded, there was a single line written under Elara's name. She stayed still so the cubs could sleep, nothing more. No medals, no long reports, no dramatic descriptions. Just that one sentence, but it was enough. Anyone who read it could feel what it meant. It wasn't about heroism or fame. It was about empathy, the kind of strength that doesn't come from power, but from compassion. The predators, too, carried their own version of her story. In their tongue, the words were different, but the meaning was the same. They passed it down through generations, the tale of the human who shared her warmth instead of fear. And when humans and predators finally stood together under one sky, sharing food and trade instead of territory and conflict, her name was spoken with respect in both languages. Scientists called it a turning point in the planet's history. The rest simply called it the Night of Stillness. Elara's old research station became a quiet museum years later. Her coat, the same one that had sheltered the cubs, was placed behind glass, its fabric faded but intact. People would come from far settlements to stand before it, reading the small plaque beneath. Some would smile, some would cry, and some would simply stand in silence, imagining that night, the endless storm, the freezing cold, and one person's decision to choose care over fear. Outside, the world had grown warmer, both literally and in spirit. Colonies spread wider, cooperation became natural, and children grew up knowing that the creatures once called monsters were now friends. None of it happened overnight, but every step of progress could be traced back to that moment, a human heart choosing kindness in a place where no one expected it. Sometimes, at night, when the wind howled across the plains, older settlers said it sounded almost like a whisper, gentle, rhythmic, like a lullaby carried by the cold. "She stayed still so the cubs could sleep," they would say, repeating the line softly as if it were a prayer. It was no longer just Elara's story. It had become a part of who they were, proof that humanity's greatest strength wasn't in building walls or fighting wars, but in something far simpler, the courage to care, even when the world gave no reason to. And somewhere, beyond the frozen ridges and silver plains, two descendants of those same predator cubs would sometimes wander near the old station. They would pause by the glass walls where the old coat still hung under gentle light and rest there quietly before moving on. No one knew why they came, but everyone understood. The warmth she gave had never really faded. It had simply changed shape, carried forward in every act of peace that followed.